the vast majority of judges, both state here in Alaska that I work with and federal, are really just trying to grapple with what is the law. And even if I disagree with that result, that's what I'm bound to do. And people think, oh, judges are just doing what they think is the right answer. But it's really a much more rigorous and intellectual challenge to try to figure out what the actual law is.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Alaska, Sharon Gleason. She was appointed by Barack Obama in 2012 after serving 11 years on the Alaska Superior Court. She is the first woman to serve as a federal judge for Alaska. Yesterday, March 29th, 2024, Chief Judge Gleason released a 20-page ruling against the state of Alaska and in favor of protecting the Kuskokwim River from fishermen from urban areas. This is a win for rural subsistence. You can read more about this at the Alaska Beacon, where it is the top story today. Her fame also stems from important environmental rulings. In 2019, she found that President Trump unlawfully sought to open the Chukchi Sea for offshore drilling. That same year, she also blocked road construction between King Cove and Cold Bay. And in November 2023, she upheld the Biden administration's approval of the Willow project, rejecting Inupiat and environmental claims against it. This interview came about after I gave a special order on the House floor in honor of the country of Estonia's Independence Day. Our guest today, Judge Sharon Gleason, is the most famous Estonian in Alaska. She is the granddaughter of Timotius Grünthal. He was an Estonian politician serving in the Estonian parliament. Her grandmother was Vera Poska Grünthal, who was a leading Estonian feminist who helped found the International Federation of Women's Lawyers. Vera's father was Jan Poska. Jan Poska is our guest's great-grandfather. He was mayor of the capital of Estonia from 1913 to 1917, and then became the governor of the Autonomous Governorate of Estonia in 1917. The Republic of Estonia was formally declared on the 24th of February 1918, and Judge Gleason's great-grandfather was a drafter of the Estonian Constitution. So our guest today is a direct descendant of a founding father of Estonia, and it is an honor to have her on the show. This interview was recorded on Zoom, and there was a sound issue with Judge Gleason's microphone. I apologize for the buzzing sound. It's not you, it's me, and I'm sorry. Judge Sharon Gleason, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So to get started, tell us about your childhood.
I grew up in upstate New York in Rochester. We had two flags up at our house, the American flag and the Estonian flag. And it was a pretty happy childhood. I had a good time, lots of friends and siblings and activities.
And I want to talk about that Estonian heritage. Can you talk about your Estonian family?
I never went to Estonia until probably the first trip was 2012. So I don't know a whole lot about my Estonian family. And that was the same year, actually, that I met my first cousin who lives in Stockholm, who is my mother's brother's oldest son.
Were both your parents Estonian?
No, just my mom. My mom, I can tell you her story. She was born in 1925 in Tartu, the city at the south of Estonia, and grew up out her childhood in Estonia. They spent summers in an island called Muhu, which is out in the Baltic Ocean to the west of mainland Estonia. And all was pretty good until the Germans occupied Estonia during World War II. And she lived in Estonia during that occupation and then left Estonia when the Soviets were taking over as Estonia as a Soviet republic toward the end of the war, and took a boat with women and children, one of the last boats. She took a boat with her sister and her mother to Stockholm and with many other Estonians, and was at a refugee camp in Stockholm for not that long, less than a year, several months. And then she got an offer for a full ride to the University of Rochester and took a boat across the ocean and arrived at U of R in 48 or 49 and enrolled at the university, really not speaking any English at all, but made it through, learned English, and met my father, who was born and raised here in the United States, many generations, but was studying to be a doctor there. And they fell in love and got married in 1950. And
What languages did your mother speak?
she spoke Estonian and English, but when she came to, and I'm sure some Swedish because she had lived in Sweden by then for several years, they moved into Stockholm eventually from the refugee camp. And my grandmother, her mother, lived in Stockholm her entire life, as did my mother's two brothers. One is still they lived in Stockholm and in Lidingö, which is south of Stockholm in Sweden. And then my mother's older sister, whom she was quite close to, became a Canadian citizen and lived in Canada her whole life, Montreal, primarily when I was growing up. So we'd go see her every year, and my mother and her sister would speak Estonian, and we never understood what they were talking about, much to our chagrin, my sister's mother and I. But yes, that was what I knew. And I met my grandmother several times. She came to the United States to visit us a few times. And I went when I was living here abroad in college in France. I went up to Stockholm and spent several days with her then, but limited contact with her.
That's so interesting. When you went to visit your grandmother in Sweden, did she talk about her father?
Not that I recall. No.
So when did you find out that your great grandfather had been the first governor of Estonia and then the foreign affairs minister?
At some level all along, I'm sure my mom talked about it to some degree. She didn't talk much about her childhood. She talked some about the Germans, and I don't remember her ever talking about Jan Polska, her grandfather. I really don't. But she didn't talk really much at all about her childhood. So when did I learn? I knew that fact, but it wasn't discussed.
And your grandmother was herself an important person.
She certainly was. She was a force to be reckoned with. My mom did talk in her later years about they almost missed the last boat, the refugee boat to Stockholm, because my grandmother was still trying to help other people to get out of the country. It was really a people that had been tied into the Estonian government when it was an independent country from 1920 to the Soviet republic, really were at risk of being killed, quite frankly. And so it was a very perilous time for people. And certainly being the offspring of Jan Posko, they knew they were all at risk. Well, I have two relatives left in Estonia. I have met some, but the ones that I have there are descendants from or related to the Gruntal side, my grandfather's side, not the Poska side. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting for me as somebody who lived in Estonia, and Estonia is such an important part of my life, because when I look at your grandmother and your great-grandfather, I think, oh my gosh, what would it be like to have descended from these celebrities? But I wonder, did you feel like you were descended from celebrities? Or what was your feeling about Estonia growing up?
My mom was so proud of Estonia and to be Estonian, but we didn't focus really on our relatives so much as the country. So I certainly learned the Estonian national anthem. I could sing it now, but I'm not going to. And I'm not a very good singer. And we did take some Estonian lessons. I do remember that from an Estonian woman that taught children Estonian. And we had Estonian outfits, but in terms of her own history and her life, it was not a subject she was comfortable talking about. I think it was a really hard. She talked when we were older about the Germans pointing rifles at their home on Muhu when it was just my mom and her siblings, and neither parent was home, and that they hid in the woods. That was not a subject she wanted to go and explore more.
Mm. Was there an Estonian community in Rochester?
No, very limited. There was this woman she found that taught lessons, but no, not to speak of at all. There was much more in Montreal, and then later in Toronto, there was quite an Estonian presence. I know my aunt, or my mother's older sister, was quite active with the Estonian community in Montreal.
Do you have any relationship with the Estonian community now?
Do I? I don't. My son does. He became an EU citizen, an Estonian citizen, by virtue of his grandmother's birth in Estonia prior to 1940. And he was able to meet like our second cousins twice removed, or people on the Gruntal side who are related to us. And I ended up going to Estonia and meeting him there and met the family, which was really a delight. And we had a tour from another Estonian who was another second cousin twice removed type person who is active in the Estonian government and gave us a tour of the president's house. And we saw, and this was very cool, one of the original versions of the treaty that my great grandfather signed when Estonia became independent. So that was really a highlight.
Did you see his signature?
Yes, yes.
Oh, that's so exciting.
It was very cool.
You grew up in Rochester, and did you always know that you wanted to be a lawyer?
No. I actually went to college, got a history degree, and then I enrolled in the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and went to that school in Tufts, thinking of the Foreign Service. And I dropped out after a semester, mainly because I decided I was not good at taking lots of orders from people and having those sets of orders change every 4 to 8 years. And that's when I became much more interested in law. And I applied to law schools that were state universities at the time. The tuition in the early 80s was, I don't want to say it because people would be so shocked at how little we paid, but the dean at Davis comes by here every few years and shows us a chart of how little we paid when they're asking for us to donate.
Right. So my understanding is you got your law degree from UC Davis and that you had come up to Alaska for a year and were planning to go back and practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. So what was that first job in Alaska for that year and why'd you stay?
My first job was a very common job for new lawyers, and that was to be a law clerk to a judge. And I was one of 2 law clerks to the Chief Justice of the Alaska Supreme Court, Ed Burke at the time. So I came up for what I knew was a 1-year job. And in the course of that year, I decided this would be a really great place to stay, raise a family, and work. And San Francisco, I had spent the summer between my second and third year of law school working at a large firm, and I could see that work was not going to be one that would be as rewarding for what I was looking for. Meaning, when I worked there, they rolled in a huge cart of discovery and said, "Here you go." So things were not electronically filed then, and said, "Your job this summer is to go through these tens of thousands of pages and organize and put them together." And I thought, I don't want to do that for the first few years of being a lawyer, which was clearly what people were doing at that firm and in most other firms.
So you were based predominantly in Anchorage in the beginning?
Almost all my clients were in Anchorage. I did a lot of family law. I did divorces, adoptions. I did a lot of adoptions. And I had a side business representing a person who brokered limited entry permits and vessels, which was a nice contrast to divorces. That was my main work. And then I applied to the Superior Court several times. And I finally was the person that was selected by Governor Knowles in 2001. And that's when I became a state court judge.
And that's when you started traveling.
Not really traveling that much, but I was the assigned judge for Unalaska. So at the time, and still today, I believe, Unalaska does not have a sitting judge. It has a magistrate judge who can assist in a lot of the day-to-day affairs, but it didn't have a judge that could preside over most cases. So I'd go out every 3 months and hear cases, and including criminal, which I like because in the Superior Court still today, you're either in Anchorage, you're either all civil or all criminal. You don't really get the mix of cases, unlike here where I do all of it.
I found a quote from you talking about doing divorce and family law, where you mentioned that, especially with child custody issues, that once you had your own children, you actually thought about those cases differently. Can you talk a little bit about how your philosophy shifted once you had your own children?
That's really interesting. I don't remember saying that, but I think that if you're a parent, or at least when I became a parent, you get a little more flexible on meeting your child's needs. And if you make macaroni from scratch and you think you've done this magnificent job and they say, really, I want the craft, it's better. I went back to making the craft. I thought, good enough for me then. And so I think that it was the same in my practice, that I expected and held parents to a pretty high standard before I had kids myself. And then I think I hope, for understanding of the challenge.
I should have read the quote to you. What you said was that when you first started practicing, you were too ready to litigate cases involving child custody issues. But once you had your own children, you counseled clients forcefully to settle those disputes amicably out of court.
Oh, yeah, that would be very true. Yes. In the 80s, I was called Dragon Lady by several opposing counsel before I had my kids in the late 80s, 90s. It just, I think you see the pain that could cause too. And then my practice really in the 90s as a divorce lawyer was much more property division. So I didn't do much custody work at all. Once I developed enough of a reputation, I could pick and choose my cases. I tended to pick cases where it was people arguing about money as opposed to their children. But then when I got back on the Superior Court, it went right back to primarily custody.
It sounds like that one of the things that you liked about being able to go out to Unalaska and do criminal and civil, having that variety seemed to be something that you enjoyed. And I'm just curious about whether it's better for a judge to be an expert in a specific field or to have that more varied experience and be more of a jack of all trades.
That's an interesting question. I think for me personally, it's a much more interesting job to have the variety of cases. Whether the public is better served probably depends on the person and on the issue. For example, I do think that specialized in bankruptcy, our bankruptcy judges better serve the public because then it's such a specialized area. Immigration judges at the agency level, I think it's the same thing. I think if you're open-minded and to learn, that it's a great job to be in a generalist role. Most people, I think, in their careers get more and more specialized, and that's just the nature of our society right now. Whereas I think being a judge at this level, at the trial court level, is such a great job because of the variety that's presented every day as a different issue.
Now you're the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Alaska, correct?
That's correct.
And so you were appointed by President Obama.
The two senators, primarily Senator Begich, when I was selected for nomination, were active in process of sending names to the president. And it's my understanding, and I'm probably one of the least informed on the whole process, it's a bit of a mystery, but that since Senator Begich was in the same party as President Obama, that he took more of the lead, much more of the lead, at least for the position that I applied for.
And I did watch part of your hearing, your confirmation hearing, and I can't really imagine, had you been thinking about this happening? It just seems like being in Washington, D.C. and sitting in that very formal proceeding and having the senators question you. I just wonder if you could talk about that life experience.
It was a little surprising. We met, all four of the candidates met the day before with Department of Justice people that were there to prepare us. And they, for the questions, and they said, all four of you, we really don't anticipate any issue at all. You should all sail through. So we were all feeling pretty good about that. And then the four of us are all in a row there with the questioning. And Senator Grassley, who was in a major role, he was the chair. And he said, I have a question for just one of you. And we could all take in our collective breath. And then he said, Judge Gleason. And I could feel the tension on the other three people just dissipate right next to me. They were like, yes. And then he asked me questions that I had not given any thought to, that publication that the Alaska Women's Commission had done in the 80s. I hadn't looked at it or thought about it or anything. And I could see myself starting to engage with him. And then a voice went up in my head that said, stop and just get through this. And I did. And then he did written questions, which are pretty standard. And I spent a lot of time writing a paragraph or whatever. And then he, at the end, voted for me, both on committee and on the floor. So I was pleased about that. But it was a stressful process. And my son was an intern at the Capitol a few years later, and I said he gave me a tour, and I said, I really want to go to the Senate Judiciary room just so I can get that chapter past me. And I walked in, my hands got clammy, sat down for a few minutes, and then I felt all better. So I was able to achieve closure on that moment. I'm really glad I went there.
Like I said, I can't really even imagine. It seems like a very stressful thing. And just now you're talking about getting surprised by things that you may have written 30 years earlier. For anyone listening, I'm sure that would be just like a surreal experience to start getting questions about that kind of stuff.
They really did very thorough research. You had to put on the report that you do beforehand, you had to list every publication and I did the best I could. Then we had internet in 2012 or whenever, 2011, I was doing all this and to research it. And I thought I'd found everything. The DOJ then double checks your work, and they found where I had been quoted as a student intern in must have been 80, when I was interning at a nonprofit after I dropped out of the Fletcher School. And nobody was in the office, so I answered the phone, and it was the Boston Globe. And there I am quoted. And they found this Boston Globe article where I said something benign, luckily.
You went from having done predominantly divorce, child custody, even property disputes in divorce, that sort of type of law, to you're known for your environmental rulings now. It just seems like a complete shift. Maybe it wasn't. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, in state court, it was probably about 50% custody and also abuse and neglect cases where children are in state custody and parents trying to regain custody. But the other half, a lot of car crashes, but also I found really interesting the work. Alaska's a young state. Our Constitution is young. And I had some fascinating cases in state court where I was called upon to be the first one to interpret a clause of the Constitution, the education clause, the public safety, some really very interesting issues. And then I did twice, different tax years, the valuation of the pipeline, when Trans-Alaska Pipeline for property tax purposes, with really very high quality lawyers on both sides. And the state was in there as well, but had less of an interest. But I love numbers, which is why I liked being a divorce lawyer. And I really liked doing those trials with figuring out a lot of numerical challenges. So this job is in some ways very similar. You're putting on a black robe and making decisions, but it's different topics. I didn't do any environmental law until I started this job to speak of, none at all in state court.
Was there a big learning curve for you in terms of learning the subject?
I'm still learning. That's what I really like about the job. And also very little in the way of rights of Native Alaskans, which is another part of federal law that we see. So I like that. But there's a lot of training for judges, federal judges, a lot of resources. And in particular, the first year I was on this job, I signed up for a class by a law school that was specifically on environmental law 101 for judges, federal judges. And that was helpful just because the field has a lot of acronyms, and they go through what they all are and how to approach them. So that was helpful. But I think I've told people before, it was definitely a switch for me, but much more so for my judicial assistant, because we went from her job being primarily copying orders and putting them in an envelope to electronic, which is a totally different. I love it now, but it was a big adjustment for her to go from a very different way of record keeping to what we do here.
A basic question for the average Alaskan, knowing what it means to be a federal court judge versus a state superior court judge, and how being the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Alaska, what does that mean in terms of our Supreme Court? And are you on par with, how do we think about these different court systems to the average person?
I think they're two totally separate court systems. We have very limited involvement directly in the state court. The only real case that comes to us, there's several. Yeah, litigants have an option at the beginning of a case. If they meet certain criteria, they can remove a case from the state court right at the beginning of the case, bring it to federal court. But then this is in our federal constitution, only if the litigants are from different states. Say, for example, an insurance company is representing somebody in a car crash issue. They might well want, and they're based in Delaware or another place, they might well want to remove to federal court. Why? I don't know. You could ask them, but they have that choice. And so we get removed cases. And then the only other real case that comes here from state court is habeas corpus. So after all appeals have been exhausted in a criminal case at state court, the parties can come here, or the defendant can come here and ask for additional review. The U.S. Supreme Court has made very clear that our review in that scenario is very limited, very deferential to the state court, but that is an option. But other than that, we're a separate track. In some cases, the litigant can choose whether they want to file in state court or federal court. And in others, they have to file here. For example, if you want to sue the federal government, you must sue at federal court or certain federal cases. Like when you're unhappy with an environmental decision by a federal agency, you have to come into federal court. But some cases can be brought in either state or federal. But really, they go separate tracks. The only time the tracks merge is if a district court issues a decision and it's appealed, it goes to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. If it's appealed again, it goes, and the U.S. Supreme Court accepts the appeal, that's their choice, then it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And if it goes to the state Supreme Court, then in some cases, the litigant can appeal a federal question to that same court, to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's really only at the Supreme Court of the United States that there's a merger of our two court systems. Otherwise, it's frankly something I miss. I don't interact much with my state court colleagues like I used to.
I know that state judges, there's a mandatory retirement age of 70. Are you a lifetime appointment? Can you work forever?
Theoretically, yes, if you wanted, but we have a rule of 80, which is a convoluted rule that is looking at a person's years of service and age and spits out an age at which each individual judge can retire. But basically, the later in your career you start, the fewer years of service you need to do. And so I'll reach that rule next year, and then I can opt to go senior, and that means take fewer cases if I chose to do, but maintain the same basic benefits. So it's written into our Constitution. It's a very generous compensation. And one that there's also, I think there's been sensitivity over the years to the concern about judges staying on too long. And we do have a Ninth Circuit, and every circuit has a disability council that people that are concerned about the disability of a judge can raise concerns through that channel.
You're my second judge that I've ever interviewed for the podcast. I don't know if you know the first judge I interviewed, Michael Wolverton.
Oh, yes.
I interviewed him shortly after his mandatory retirement, and he hated the mandatory retirement. He loved being a judge, and he felt that maybe when they wrote the Constitution, 70 was an old age, but that he didn't feel 70 was an old age anymore. And he really had a problem with it.
I know, and I know other judges that's my generation that feel the same way. Certainly, in all candor, that was something that attracted me to this job, is that I get to decide how long I want to remain active, and the ability to have a partial caseload is great. Plus, I've made a lot of great friends, colleagues throughout the circuit, especially, that it's nice to go and meet with at events that we have. So I enjoy that. I sat by designation in Arizona for 6 years. So I was essentially a judge in Alaska and in Arizona. They had an emergency shortage of judges. And that was a great experience.
You've ruled in so many cases that have national media attention when you are basically ruling against the president of the United States or their administration. What is that like? Or did that give you pause? Did you know you were going to be making national news? Or do you just do your job?
Try pretty hard to just do my job. And I've told my law clerks, I give it my best shot. Some of the cases that I decide, I know I'm just one step on the way, that people are not going to say, oh, Judge Gleason got it right, and we'll just accept that decision. People have a right to appeal. It's really important, and they're going to in these cases. And that's all good. And in some level, it gives me comfort in knowing that I'm giving it my best shot. And if other people see it differently and reverse and remand, so be it. That's our system. So what I've said to the clerks is, I'm not a brain surgeon. You don't get a second chance. Your knife slips and it's all over. And whereas our job has a lot of checks and balances, and I think that's a really great part of our justice.
Does it hurt your feelings any way at all if your decision is reversed?
It depends on the case. So sometimes I've issued decisions where I've been very much on the fence. And I thought the law's unsettled. And if I get reversed, I'm like, yeah, I get that. Sometimes I think I got it right and the circuit missed something. And sometimes I read the circuit decision and I think, oh boy, I messed up on that one. I'm glad somebody cleaned it up. So it really depends on the case. And yeah, so sometimes I don't mind getting reversed. Like I say, I think it's a good part of our system.
You talked about not having a lot of interaction with the state court system anymore and maybe missing those colleagues. Do you have a new peer group among federal judges that you interact with on a regular basis?
Yeah, so I'm on a committee that does jury instructions, rather finely tuned quest that we take on, but we meet quarterly. And it's a group of 9 of us. They're all judges, and I really enjoy those meetings. Our work is really interesting, actually. We'll spend a day or two going through proposed change, all the recent case law, but then we'll have dinners together those days. And I've traveled with judges. I went with a group of women judges on a 6-day hike in Scotland, and doing another trip next year with a group of women judges. So that I really enjoy. And most of the women that I've become friends with are Ninth Circuit, but some outside the circuit. But those are the ones we see much more frequently.
You said there was the option of going senior once you've reached that rule of 80. Do most folks choose that, or do some people retire completely? And what do you think you'll do?
I don't know what I'll do. I'm going to decide when I'm eligible. Some folks don't go senior for whatever reason, for various reasons. Some people leave and become mediators. That's not common here in Alaska, but in like LA, New York, some of the big cities, they can become private mediators and pursue that. Most that I can think of take senior status and take a reduced caseload at some point after they're eligible.
Do you think about what your legacy will be or what the cases are that you'll be remembered by?
No, I actually don't. No. I do the best I can.
So last question, do you have any misconception or something that you feel most folks don't understand about what being a judge is that you'd like to clear up?
I do think that maybe there are some judges that rule based on what they think the right result is for them personally. But I think the vast majority of judges, both state here in Alaska that I work with, that federal, are really just trying to grapple with what is the law. And even if I disagree with that result, that's what I'm bound to do. And so I think that people think, oh, judges are just doing what they think is the right answer. But it's really a much more rigorous and intellectual challenge to try to figure out what the actual law is and apply it correctly.
This is interesting because that's come up in this building very recently. The argument that there's no such thing as nonpartisan. We have lots of nonpartisan staff who work in the building. We have lots of folks who work on ethics committees who have these lifelong resumes of being completely nonpartisan, never registering for a party, trying to make sure that there's never a question that they're on one side or the other. And folks saying that's absolutely impossible and taking offense to someone even saying that they are nonpartisan. And it's been a hot subject of debate very recently in the building.
That's interesting. I just feel very fortunate. My colleagues here, I think all feel the same way. Even if we came from different backgrounds, different political involvement or not, I think that's been my sense of my colleagues. We're all just trying to best we can.
Would you recommend any books to anybody?
I just read remarkably brilliant creatures about the octopus. It's it's fiction, but I really enjoyed that. You do have a book club thing, so that just read that and found that remarkably bright creature. That's it.
About octopus. I will recommend it. Thank you, Judge Sharon Gleason. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Thank you so much for your service to Alaska. And we are very grateful for being here and for your service.
All right. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care.
I will now play the speech that led to this interview. Here is my special order from last month on the floor of the House.
Topic of Estonia.
Representative Gray.
1 week ago today, Madam Speaker, the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, died in prison. For all intents and purposes, he was murdered by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Navalny's consistent message to supporters was, do not be afraid. Our fear is their power. And he was not afraid. Although his death saddened the world, and his courage and moral rectitude in the face of unspeakable injustice serve as an inspiration to anti-corruption activists everywhere, his death was not a shock. Everyone knew after Putin's previous attempts on his life that Navalny's return to Russia would end this way. Vladimir Putin is one in a long line of horrific Russian dictators that have violated human rights and committed terrible atrocities against their own people. One of Alaska's heroes, Vic Fisher, observed those nightmares firsthand in the 1930s. Millions of others have observed those nightmares too, none less than the populations of the former Soviet Union. One of those countries is Estonia, and tomorrow, February 24th, the Baltic country of Estonia, just south of Finland, just north of Latvia, will be celebrating 106 years of independence. In 1918, they won their freedom from the Russian Empire and embarked on their first foray into self-determination as their own democracy. The Estonian people settled their land over 10,000 years ago, but throughout that long history, they were never their own country. They had been the property not only of Russia, but also of Sweden and others, constantly changing hands as new empires took over. But in 1918, they were finally a free people. 106 years may sound off, since from 1940 to 1988, they were technically part of the Soviet Union. But for the Estonian people, they were never Soviet. They were always Estonian. They were occupied against their will and forced to learn Russian, forced to participate in a communist economy, forced to close their churches. But in their hearts, they never surrendered. And so, yes, they count their independence from 1918, 106 years. Estonia is a member of the European Union and of NATO. This gives them a degree of protection and security that neighboring countries like Ukraine do not have. 2 weeks ago, the leading Republican candidate for president of the United States stated that not only would he consider not going to war to protect NATO allies, but if they hadn't paid their fair share, he would even tell Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want, end quote. This is alarming to our NATO allies. It's alarming to me, and it is alarming to Estonia. Even though they are more than paid up, please hear that. Estonia has always invested in its military to the amount that NATO requires. I lived in Estonia in my 20s. In fact, I was living there on 9/11 in 2001. Estonians rallied around me. They wept for what happened in our country, and it wasn't just words. Estonia deployed to Afghanistan and to Iraq in support of America's mission, and they suffered casualties. 11 Estonian soldiers were killed, and hundreds more were injured. And that may not sound like a lot, but for a country of just 1.4 million people, it actually is a lot. And for those Estonian families who lost a loved one in service to Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, there is a hole in their hearts that will never be filled, and they will never forget it. And I will never forget it either. I want Estonia to know that we Americans respect our treaties, we keep our word, we thank them for their sacrifice, and we will repay it if and when the time comes. To not do so is unfathomable to me. On the 106th anniversary of their independence, I want Estonia to hear that, Madam Speaker. With your indulgence, I would like to try to say a few words in Estonian. I will identify myself. I will explain that the Estonian people are an inspiration, and I will wish them a happy Independence Day.
Without objection.
Tervist Eesti. Olen Alaska osariigi esindajatekoja liige Andrew Gray ja pärdin teie poole esindajatekoja saalist. Eesti muld ja Eesti süda on meille kõigile inspiratsiooniks. Mina armastan sind, Eestimaa. Palju õnne vabariigi aastapäevaks. Aitäh, Madam Speaker.
Thank you to Judge Gleason for being on the show today. The book she recommended was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call our office at 907-465-4940.